Welcome back to our Paradise series. And today we're going to talk about the Promised Land. But first, Johnny, Packers played the Cowboys this weekend. And maybe people that are listening aren't big sports fans, but this is who we are. So this is important. I'm a
Sure.
huge Packers fan. You're a huge Cowboys fan. It was largely disappointing that we tied to me, and it was somewhat, I don't know, positive of a tie for you, which is the funny thing about sports. I just want to know, are we tied? It's great for our staff morale. We don't have to argue or whatever.
Yeah.
What's your view on ties in sports?
I don't like ties. I didn't even like the tie the other day, to be honest with you. Um, I think I think in competition you try to win, and there should be a winner and a loser. I will say though, you're spot on that the fact that I was like kind of happy that we actually tied you guys shows you the state of our team versus the state of your team. Because I think you're a top four team in the NFL, and we might be a bottom four team in the NFL. So the fact that we tied 40 to 40 is just kind of ironic and funny at the same time.
You know, how this is relevant is they say that they're going to take their team to the promised land. That's the Super Bowl. And every single year
Nice
I
tie-in.
hear we're going to take the team to the promised land. I hear it from
Mm.
Packers fans and media. And just like the Israelites, it doesn't look good for a little bit. And then we start complaining and bailing and jumping ship. And I feel like we've been punished. I feel like the Packers fans have been punished because we are tantalized by success and it just gets pulled out right from under us. And I feel like you probably could experience something similar with Dallas, right?
We have very high expectations, and oftentimes my heart is broken by the Cowboys. But I really liked how you did the football tie-in to the Promised Land. That was very well done.
Thanks, that's what I get paid the big bucks for this. So Promised Land, let's start with who, what, when, where, and why. Because I don't know if the average Bible reader fully understands the scope of the eternity concept of the promised land. I think the average person might think it was, just land that was promised to Israelites, and then they complained and eventually they got it, but then all right, bye-bye, it's been conquered. But it's still relevant throughout scripture, and a lot of people view it as relevant today. So can you go
Mhm.
into the who, what, when, where, why?
That's a great setup. Just big picture Promised Land, I think elicits an idea of hope. So like even in your football analogy, let's get to the Promised Land. You're looking forward to something that is good, that you're not there yet. So where does that even come from? And it actually starts all the way back in the very first book of the Bible, the book of Genesis. And in Genesis 12, the Lord calls Abram, who we now know later as he changed his name to Abraham, from Ur of the Chaldees, think like Babylon, Babylonia before they even existed, different culture. But he called them out. He called him out, and he says, I want you to leave your country, and I want you to leave your relatives, and I want you to go to a land that I will show you. So he's taking him to a land, and that's in Genesis 12. And then you get to Genesis 13, and the Lord he's in the land. And he says, I want you to look northward and southward and eastward and westward. And he says, everything that you see, I'm going to give you this land. And it's just kind of neat that kind of the idea of the promised land really originates from God promising land to Abraham. And we'll get into it a little bit more here in a second. But that's kind of like our Sunday school class, if you remember, with Bob Booker, Walk Through the Bible. He's going through the Abrahamic covenant. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah. Is it promised with a D or is it promise no D? What's the correct pronunciation?
Pro the promised with a D, promised land. It's land that has been past tense promised, and you are looking forward to going towards it future. So like even just like I want to read from Genesis 13, the Lord said to Abram after Lot had separated from him, now lift up your eyes, look up to the place where you are. As I just said, north, south, east, west. For all the land that you see, I will give it to you and your descendants forever. So it's literal land. He's not just talking figuratively space, but he's saying like this is literal land, and I'm going to give it to you and your descendants for the rest of your life. No, he says forever. So there's an eternal element to it. And then it's interesting that God specifically, and it's mentioned in scripture, he made this promise to Abraham, but he reaffirmed it to Abraham's son Isaac, but not his son Ishmael. And in Genesis 26, the Lord said to Isaac, I will multiply your descendants as the stars of heaven, and I will give your descendants all these lands. So he reaffirms the covenant that he made to his father Abraham, and then he does that to Abraham's grandson Jacob, Isaac's son Jacob, but not his son Esau. So there's always a distinction. God made a distinction amongst Abram, and then he makes a distinction to Isaac, not Ishmael, now to Jacob and not Esau. In Genesis 28, as Jacob was leaving the land, he was going to he was fleeing from his brother Esau, who wanted to kill him, and he had a dream at Bethel. And the Lord came to him in a dream and said, I am the Lord, the God of your father Abraham, the God of Isaac. The land on which you lie, I will give it to you and to your descendants. And then he says, your descendants are going to be like the dust of the earth. They will spread out to the west and to the east and to the north and to the south. And in you and in your descendants shall all the families of the earth be blessed. Behold, I am with you and will keep you wherever you go, and I will bring you back into this land. So
Hmm.
there's this huge concept in Genesis that God has promised the family of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob land. And he's also promised descendants as numerous as the stars of the sky and the dust of the sea, that there's this seed, this offspring, this massive amount of people that will come from their family. And then finally, blessing. And in you, all the families of the earth will be blessed. So all of that is wrapped up in the Abrahamic covenant, as Bob Booker would say, land, seed, blessing, literal, eternal, unconditional. There was no conditions. God unilaterally chose, I'm going to bless you with this covenant.
So we had Jacob and Esau, Ishmael and Isaac, and we saw a split in the brothers. And typically in the Old Testament, the younger brother usurped the older brother,
Hmm.
as what showed God's sovereign plan, because the older brother would get usually the blessing of the father and the riches and all that stuff, the inheritance. And we see Jacob become Israel. And what happens with like Esau and Ishmael? Are they still destined to a certain land, or did they have the choice, and just the fallout from there happening? Because I've heard, Esau and Palestine tied together.
Hmm.
Is that something that was part of God's plan too, in your opinion, or would just the fallout happen from their decisions?
Well, God still blessed them because they were children of Abraham. Even when the Lord had Abraham send Ishmael away, Ishmael was very blessed, and he actually had 12 sons who were 12 princes. And it says that he settled to the east of his brother. And that literally could mean east of Isaac, but it also could mean in opposition to. It could be a figure of speech, and it might be double meaning, like literally he's to the east, but also in contention with. And so the family of Ishmael, um, kind of biologically, became the Arab people. So as you look today, there's contention between the family of Isaac and the family of Ishmael, even today. And even as you continue down, the family of Jacob, which is still Israel, that Jacob's name was literally changed to Israel, and Esau, the Edomites. I think more it's easier to see a distinction of the Ishmaelites today as the Arab people, um, versus the people of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, known as the 12 tribes of Israel. But there was some tension there, and there's been tension there the last 4,000 years.
You mentioned Jacob and Israel, the name shift. Just
Yeah,
real quick, could you imagine wrestling Jesus?
that
What's that
that is a
like?
crazy passage because remember, God, I mean, Jacob was gone, I think, for 20 years in Haran, and he goes with nothing. He leaves with his staff. He's fleeing from his brother. He gets married to Rachel and Leah, and then he has two other wives who were their maidservants. He's coming back to the land. God's like, you need to come back to the land. And he has 12 sons and a daughter named Dinah, and maybe even more daughters, but we know of Dinah. And the night before he was about to meet Esau, he was afraid of his life. He's wrestling with the angel of the Lord who identifies himself as Yahweh. And
Hmm.
as we kind of biblical theology, where you try to put together pieces of the Bible that make sense about God, you realize that that angel of the Lord who is Yahweh himself, it couldn't have been the Father or the Spirit. It had to be the Son. So, like you said, Jesus, that's how we know him now. the Jesus before he was known as the name Jesus, wrestled with Jacob. And Jacob somehow knew there was something unique about him because he says, I'm not going to let you go until you bless me. And then Jesus touches him in a way that seems almost like supernatural, where it's like he just touched him and he dislocated his hip. And
Yeah.
so it's a crazy story. How do you do that? But then he's like, you've wrestled with God, and that's even the name Israel. It can either mean God fights or he who contends with God. And it's kind of interesting that Jacob contended with God. And in their history, God has always contended for Israel. He's fought for his people.
Yeah. Jesus, get off me. Ow, gosh, stop it. Stop it. Please. Like it's like you're fighting with a brother. Tap out, tap out. Like just the concept of that is rather entertaining to me. Last question on you mentioned patriarchs. Um, this has nothing to do with the promised land, but it's something that I've been asked. What is the connection between the patriarchs? So we go Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and the process of having children with multiple wives. Does that shift? Like old covenant, it's more, would you say, accepting, or just human error that was more common back in that day?
I think it was wrong from the beginning. I
Hmm.
think that it was, we do this today. When there's a sin that we like to justify, we can come up with all sorts of reasons why it's okay, why it's permissible. And they might say, well, if your first wife wasn't able to have children, then you could get a second wife so that you could continue. And there were permissions where someone would raise up the name of a deceased brother's family for him, but that's called a love right marriage. But I think that's even a different situation. What we're talking about, having multiple wives, I think you can make a strong biblical argument going back to creation itself, which we started with, where Adam and Eve are married. And God says, for this reason, a man shall leave his father and mother and cleave to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. And if you really think about it, who were Adam and Eve's father and mother? Well, they didn't have one. Like, in a sense, God directly created them, right? So I think that God was establishing a principle right then and there for marriage for their descendants. For this reason, a man shall leave his father and mother and cleave to his wife, singular, not plural.
Hmm.
And then Jesus later on talks about the two shall become one flesh. He doesn't say the four shall become one flesh. He's talking about a husband and a wife joining together in marriage in the sight of God, making a covenant, and they are now one flesh. So I think even going back to the very, very beginning, marriage was intended for one husband and one wife.
So we want to look at a 30,000 feet process leading from first mention to the arrival, and you have the promises of
Hmm.
God to Abraham that he have his land for his people and bless his descendants. And then God's people go into captivity in Egypt, and then Moses comes and 10 plagues, and you know the story. And then they're walking back to the promised land, and they're spending a long time in a situation that is not what they thought. They thought this is going to be a heaven. This is going to be perfect. We're not going to have to want anymore. We're going to have perfect conditions. And they start turning on God. They just take us back to being slaves, and they start
Yeah.
whining and complaining, such
Hmm.
as humans do. Did I miss anything important in that lead
Well,
up?
I think you hit the high points. I just want to do a little deeper dive on the Exodus part, because I think when I hear Promised Land, my initial thought is the Exodus coming out of Egypt into the promised land. But before you get to that, you need to understand the foundations of that: Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, the 12 tribes. And so at the very beginning, or excuse me, at the very end of the book of Genesis, remember Jacob's about to die. And he makes Joseph swear to him that he doesn't bury him in Egypt, that he takes him back to the burial place of his fathers, which was in a cave back in the promised land. At the time, it was called the land of Canaan. So Jacob wants to be buried in the land. Then the same thing happens with Joseph. As Joseph's about to die, in the last few verses of the whole book of Genesis, Joseph says, I want you to bury me. I want you to someday take my bones back into the promised land. And then we go on into the book of Exodus. And I think this is very significant because it talks about the family of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, the 12 tribes that are in Israel, or excuse me, Egypt for 400 years. And God takes notice of their situation because they went there blessed, and they were incredibly blessed. And Joseph was the most powerful man other than Pharaoh. But then something changed. There was a Pharaoh who did not know Joseph and who was very suspicious of that family, the Israelites. So in Exodus 2, it says, "Now it came in the course of many days that the king of Egypt died, and the sons of Israel sighed because of the bondage, and they cried out." So the situation of this family is in Egypt, they're enslaved, and their cry for help because of their bondage rose up to God. So God heard their groaning, and God remembered his covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And God saw the sons of Israel, and God took notice of them. So just pause right there for a moment. Think about their suffering, and they're crying out, and God hears them, and God sees them, and God remembers the promises that he's made to them.
I
And that
want you to
goes back.
clear up real quick because I learned
Yes.
this from teaching people who have no Bible awareness. Sometimes words we think are obvious are not obvious.
Yes.
Define remembered, because someone that doesn't have Bible awareness would go, he forgot.
Yeah, no. God never forgets. God is timeless. God's eternal, right? But God remembered, it's displaying that there was a promise he made, and we just talked about it. What was the promise? It was the promise of blessing to Abraham. Yeah, I will give you land. I will give you descendants as numerous as the stars of the sky, and I will, through your family, all the nations of the earth will be blessed. God is saying, I made a promise and I'm going to keep my promise. And even though I've allowed you to go through a season of struggle where it seems as if I forgot, I'm going to take action now to demonstrate to you that no, I did not forget. I'm going to show by my actions that I remember, I'm faithful, I'm telling the truth to my promises. So I think that's what, when the language says he remembered, that's a great point. He's demonstrating by his actions that he's going to follow through on something he's already promised.
So go ahead. I'm sorry, I interjected
No,
though
no, no.
with a
So,
little.
so,
So go
so
ahead.
I think the whole concept of the promised land, there's two massive points that we have to understand. And we just talked about the first one is Genesis. It's a promise that God made to Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and their descendants, right? And then they go to Egypt, and it seems like God forgot the promise. And then, like you said, he remembered. What does that mean? He's going to fulfill his promise. God keeps his promises. He keeps his word. So then he's going to raise up somebody to be the instrument by which he fulfills that promise. And that somebody is a guy named Moses. So then you go on into Exodus 3. The Lord appears to him in a burning bush. And God says to Moses, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. Now, those guys lived 500 years before Abraham. So why did he pick out those three guys to tell Moses, I'm the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob? Why do you think he picked those three guys?
It's a great question. Take it away.
Well, because that all has to do with the promise. The promise funneled through Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and then Jacob's sons, the 12 sons of Jacob. So God is saying, I think when he's saying, I'm the God of your fathers, I'm the God of the covenant that I made with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And he says, I have surely seen the affliction of my people who are in Egypt, and I have given heed to their cry. I am aware of their sufferings. So I have come down to deliver them from the power of the Egyptians and to bring them up from that land, to take them out of the land of Egypt. And where do you think he wants to take them? To a good and spacious land, i.e., the promised land, to a land flowing with milk and honey, to the place of the Canaanite, Hittite, Amorite, Perizzite, Hivite, Jebusite. I'm taking you back to the place where I promised the land to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob.
Would you say the milk and honey is not literal? Again, I like to think that people listening might not fully understand, and they might be picturing a place literally with flowing milk and
No,
honey. Because
that
when I was younger, as a child, I did,
I
and I would assume that the milk is more cattle related, and that sort of thing. What picture could you paint based off those two words about what that land would look like?
I agree because I just kind of thought the same thing growing up. Like, oh, I guess there's like milk and honey flowing everywhere, and this is a great example of like a process of biblical interpretation is try to take it in the grammatical historical context, and if it makes sense literally, you take it literally, but if it doesn't make sense literally, then it clearly has an allegorical meaning. And It was kind of funny last night at the dinner table. I was talking to our kids about this podcast we're going to be doing today. And we are talking about the promised land. And I said, the land flowing with milk and honey, what does that mean? And they were just thinking, and they were like, is there like a river of milk? And I was like, well, if there's a river of milk, like, should we pour cereal in it and get our spoons out? And then they were like, no, that doesn't make sense. And so clearly, I think it's an allegory for lush abundance. So where do we get milk from? We get it from cattle, we get it from goats. Well, what do they need to survive? They need lots of pasture, right? And honey, where does that come from? The honeycomb from the bees, and the bees need flowers and vegetation. So even just this concept of it's a rich land. We live
Hmm.
in Illinois now, right? You went down from the northern Wisconsin down a few hours south. This is some of the best farmland in the world. Side note, random funny story. I think it was Gillette, Gillette razors over in Boston. He had like millions of dollars, like over 100 years ago. I think it was whatever, and he could buy farmland anywhere in the world, and he bought it in Lincoln, Illinois, because he
No
said
kidding.
this is the best soil in America, is right in Lincoln, Illinois, which is like 30 minutes outside of us. And so we're known for having really rich soil that's good for crops and harvesting. And I think Israel, as you see in their history, they have vineyards, they have olive groves, they have tons of livestock. So it's a great land, agricultural land for herds and animals, and for growing gardens and vineyards and having wine and olive groves and you name it. So
I wish we were known for mountains or lakes or oceans rather than our our soil.
well, yeah, me too. But we do have pretty stinking good soil. You can ask any farmer around here.
We get to the route of Moses leading God's people to the promised land. And this is something I want to highlight because it's something that we still see today. Groaning, complaining, questioning, and
Mm,
they go, I thought this was supposed to be easy. My feet are tired. I'm hungry. And you start to see them kind of turn on God's promise and wish they had their life of slavery back. And you might go, that's insane. But I see it today. God has a plan for us all. And along that plan, we get distracted or things aren't working out well for us. And we go, well, if this is what God is about, then I don't want to be about this. My grandma died, or I
yeah.
lost my job, or my boyfriend dumped me, and we bail on the plan because I think the human condition will always find a way to complain
Mm.
and find excuses or find the easy way out. And that's partly why this Christian life is so hard and how we're supposed to carry our cross because it's going to be hard and it's not going to be easy. Like I think people truly think if I accept Jesus, it'll be like the God's people in the Exodus. Like they thought this is going to be great. This is going to be easy. Milk and honey. All right. In my mouth. I
Yeah.
got instant food. I got instant gratification. I don't have to work anymore. That's perfect. And then they sign up for life with Jesus, and it's actually not perfect. It's actually kind of hard at times and difficult, although we have the great hope, and they bail. So I see a lot of parallels between then and now. And it's not just, man, those people back then, they didn't get it. I think we haven't gotten it for a long time.
I think you're spot on, man. What a great kind of pulling that out, because that's exactly right. We live in a time where you expect, okay, so I'm going to trust Jesus and I'm going to follow Jesus, and that means everything's going to work out. I'm promised heaven, which means, aren't I promised heaven on earth right now? So like, I'm not going to get sick. I'm not going to struggle. I'm always going to have money. I'm always going to have whatever. That's not promised in the Bible. But what is promised is that we will be with Jesus one day in heaven, and it will be amazing. But we're also promised something greater even now, is that Jesus is with us forever, starting now. So that as we go through this life, we go through this journey, kind of like Israel was on a journey out of bondage towards the promised land, the person who's trusted in Christ has been set free from the bondage of sin. They're on a journey towards, John Bunyan had a great allegory towards the celestial city, i.e., heaven. You're a pilgrim. You're an alien. You're a sojourner. This is not our home. We're on a journey called life, and on this journey, we're called to trust our King. We're called to follow our King, and it's not easy, and people aren't going to like it. it's just not, it's not paradise yet, but he's still with us and he empowers us and strengthens us. So I think that was a great example what you said.
So we're going to end part one with a little tease for part two. And part two is kind of tricky because we're going to get into the current events of Israel and what our standing is there and the new covenant and all that stuff. But a little tease on the news yesterday, I saw Israel's prime minister. I don't know what his role is. Bibi. He says he quoted the Bible in a news conference. If he said, I want to make sure I said this right. He said, the Bible says, if you bless Israel, God will bless you. I don't particularly think he's theological accurate there. So I guess let's give him a little tease, John. We have to go crazy into it, but true or false?
In the most technical sense, no. God never said, if you bless Israel, you'll be blessed. He made that promise to Abram in Genesis 12. Those who bless you, I will bless, and those who curse you, I will curse. Now, I think that there is an application of that promise to the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, the 12 tribes, that I think is something that we need to consider and I think respect. Sorry, there's a fly here.
There's a fly attack in a mid-podcast.
Getting attacked by a fly. In the most technical sense, that was spoken to, at the time, his name was Abram, and it was not speaking to a nation, as was spoken by the prime minister yesterday. So I don't think that there's a crazy misapplication, but that was technically a misquote.
I think the biggest thing we need to understand is what's biblical and what's political.
It's hard. It's
hard.
not going to be easy. We'll continue next time and discuss that then.
Yeah, we're chomping at the bits to get to part two. You're going to have to check it out next week. That was part one of the Promised Land. We will see you guys next week for part two.